Services Marketing, Part 4. In Part 4, we're looking at service quality, how it is conceptualized and how it is measured. Before we do that, let's recap on Part 3. We looked at the services mix, acknowledging that all services have some mix of physical goods to some extent or another, and intangible services. We started to consider services as a process or a form of systems, and we extended our understanding of the marketing mix to incorporate the characteristics of services, extending from the 4 core P's to the 7 P's of services. So now our P's include people, processes, and physical evidence. Research into services has evolved over the decades. If we travel back to the 1960s, when services as a form of marketing and a concept was defined, at that point scholars were concerned simply with the relevance of services and identifying that services as a business were different from physical goods, and that led to defining it as an area. Moving on to the 1970s, where services marketing concepts were developed, we developed frameworks for understanding service marketing. The services marketing mix began to emerge, and service-related marketing concepts surfaced. Into the 1980s, research started to be concerned with service quality. So the idea of the service quality concept, service quality management, and service quality measurement as well. In the 1990s, the idea of the service product emerged. So we looked at productivity within services, different service factors, and service engineering and design. And today, we're concerned with service value, perceived service value on the part of customers, how customers play a part in service creation and co-creation, and process orientation of services. We're going to look at the work of Valerie Zeitamel, Parsu Parasuruman, and Leonard Berry, who have done extensive research into service quality and service management. Now, some of the stuff that they've established is that service quality is a more complex construct to understand than product quality, and that is due to the service encounter. Service quality perceptions are not objective, they are subjective for each customer, and that makes it equally challenging to conceptualize the process. They've developed different types of academic means of measuring and understanding and conceptualizing service quality, and we're going to go into some of that in detail now. We're going to look at Parasuruman, Zeitamel, and Berry's 1985 paper, where the principal contribution was this idea of the gaps model, the gap between expectations and perceptions, where customer experience happens in the middle. So in the gaps model, service quality is based on the idea that customer expectations of the service they will receive shape their perception of the actual service encounter. Thus, customers compare perceived service with expected service. Now, this includes evaluation of the outcomes of the service and the process used to achieve the outcomes. The outcomes are referred to as technical quality, and the process is referred to as the functional quality, and that was researched by Gronroos 1982. This relates to the understanding that service quality will be perceived in different ways by a customer. There's physical quality, which relates to the tangible assets like the equipment or the building. There's corporate quality, which relates to the company's brand image, its reputation and profile, etc. And finally, there's interactive quality, which relates to the encounters between the organization's personnel and its customers, as well as the contact that occurs between other customers, because remember that inter-customer contact is sometimes integral to delivering quality service experiences, like in nightclubs. Parasuruman, Zeitamel, and Berry's research uses the disconfirmation paradigm. This was previously researched by Smith and Houston 1982, And this asserts that our evaluation of service quality will be based on the extent to which our perceptions of our experience disconfirm the expectations we had when we began the experience. This is important because it's a negative foundation, which might seem pessimistic, but when we think back to the characteristics of services and the fact that managing service delivery is made challenging by the variability characteristic, actually thinking about service management from this disconfirmation perspective helps us manage service quality more effectively because it builds into the system an appreciation of the fact that services are variable and can fail. And we'll go on to discuss failure later on. We're going to go and look in detail at this model now from Parasureman, Zeitamel and Berry's paper. Now the model is found on page 44 of the paper, and you can find the article and the citation on the class reading section. The paper refers to this model as the service quality model, or you might call it the GAPS model. Let's take an overarching look at the model first. You can see it's split into two halves. You've got the marketer or organizational half at the bottom and the consumer half at the top. Now, forming the foundation of the scenario that the model represents is the perceptions the business has of its customers and its target consumer segments at large. These perceptions inform the service design and resourcing decision the business makes, which lead to the creation of service quality specifications. So you can see at the bottom, perceptions of consumer expectations informing creation of quality specifications. At the top of the model, out in the consumer world, people are busy forming their own perceptions of the service they might experience if they were to become customers of the business. We can see that these expectations are being formed by different influences, such as word of mouth from their friends and family perhaps, previous experiences in the actual business, or even perhaps experiences in other places that they perceive to be like the business in question. And indeed, our own personal needs will influence our expectations. If you think about, say, a new restaurant, if you have poor eyesight, you will want the restaurant to be well lit. If you use a wheelchair, you will require certain access to be provided. These sorts of personal requirements influence how we form expectations. And the two halves meet when that person visits and has a service experience. They encounter the service delivery and perceive the experience in a personal way. This service encounter then sends a number of cascading influences back around the different parts of this model, resulting in disconfirmation in the gaps between the perceptions at different times before and after the service encounter, and the actual experience itself that was had. Now let's look into those gaps in more detail and look at the impacts of the different kinds of gaps that emerge. Just as we saw previously, the foundational element of the service quality management dynamic is the perceptions that the business has of its customers and those customers' expectations. This is where service delivery gap 1 exists. It's about being able to make sense of and attend to the expectations of your customers. If you are fundamentally misinterpreting the expectations of your customers at the very beginning of designing and managing your service, then you are destined to create a gap in perceived service quality. In Parasureman, Zeitamel and Berry's research, they talk about how a car maintenance company thought that the fact they were a large chain of garages meant that customers thought they were higher quality, and therefore they tried to reinforce that message that they were a big company in their communications with customers and in the way they communicated during actual service encounters. In fact, when customers were asked by researchers, they said that they trust small car garages more because they think their size and independence signifies better quality and value. This created a gap at the level of customer perceptions for the large chain, because the thing they were trying to reinforce was something that made their customers form poorer expectations about them. So this is gap 1, the gap between how management of the business perceive the expectations of consumers. Now let's zoom in on the bottom half of the model. There are 3 service quality gaps that are actually created within the business side of the process. Before we get into this in more detail, let's remember that for the vast majority of scenarios we would apply this model to, we are talking about a business that already exists, like a restaurant that is busy with customers 7 days a week, or a car mechanic that has cars coming and going and phone calls flying in all hours of the day. So while the model looks quite neat, and we could think that it must be easy to take time to understand our customers and properly match our services to their expectations, we are discussing a dynamic environment. David Garvin, 1983, described it like this, quote, "It's one thing to say that management believe in defect-free products. It's quite another to take time from that busy schedule to act on the belief and stay informed." Unquote. Thus, he's outlining the continual challenge of staying in tune with your market and responding to their needs as you understand them, whilst keeping your business running. So with that in mind, let's look at gap number 2 at the bottom of the slide. Gap 2 is about how those interpretations of the consumer are taken and used in the design of a service product. If we take the example used in the paper, it might not be as simple as the gap being about understanding our perceptions. It may not be commercially viable for a business to incorporate certain things they have understood about their customer expectations, like for example, when a servicing business understands that during hot summer months, customers want quick response times for requests for servicing, say, air conditioners or lawnmowers. But this is the time of the year when the staff want to take their holidays, so the high demand cannot be met. Therefore, although Gap 2 can represent aspects where the business has failed to understand their customer, that's a normal feature of falling short of understanding expectations, Gap 2 may also include aspects where the knowledge of the customer does exist, but the means to use that knowledge do not. So Gap 2 is about service design. Gap 3 is about service delivery. Because of the variability and inseparability of services, even if management have perceived the customer effectively and then successfully translated that knowledge into a set of protocols and specifications that accurately cater for the customer in theory, those specifications then have to be understood and employed in the creation of the service by the business's personnel. Remember how we added people as an integral part of the service's marketing mix. This is the point of the journey where people either narrow or widen the gap on service quality, because they create variation within the production of the service. If my wife had invited some friends over for dinner and she had established that they really liked, say, Indonesian food, so she looked me out a recipe for a lovely Indonesian dish to cook, I still have to take the recipe and cook it well to make sure my friends have a good time. The same goes for Gap 3 in this model. No matter how well set up the business is to prepare and design its service, its employees still have to take the instructions for that service delivery and create good service. So that was Gap 3, the gap between the translation of customer perceptions into quality specifications and the actual delivery of quality service. Gap 4 is all about promises. Communications for services are challenging because they are often doing two things. They are attempting to attract customers, but they are also setting expectations around the service. Sometimes those two parts of the message are one and the same, as is often seen with service guarantees. The Premier Inn Hotel brand says a good night's sleep guaranteed or your money back. Now that is trying to use the benefit of a good night's sleep as a means of attracting customers, whilst also setting firm expectations around the service they offer. In the paper, Parasuram, Zaitamal and Berry also tell us that there are paradoxes within what businesses choose to communicate to their customers. They found that businesses believe that evidence of their service quality specifications, for example, how in a bank the staff member will be getting prompts and directions about the service interaction on the screen in front of them. Businesses believe that evidence of these quality specifications are negative, whereas customers are found to actually quite like the fact that the see evidence that the business is taking strategic steps to deliver good service, and they would like it if the business communicated these details. So Gap 4 is about understanding what the customer wants to know and how they use that information to form judgments. Let's zoom in on the top half of the model now, the customer half, and this is where the fifth and final service gap emerges. The final gap in the model, Gap 5, is probably the gap that would first come to our minds if we were to think about our own service experiences, what we thought of the experience compared to what we had originally expected it to be like. It's easy to conflate our perceptions of what happened with what actually happened in any given situation. This is why Gap 5 is important. We've all heard the phrase, "the customer is always right." This is a phrase that makes it easy to think that whatever the customer thinks, i.e. whatever the customer has perceived to be the case, is in actual fact the truth. At this point we could get quite philosophical about perceptions and facts and truth. But let's cover a short aside for a moment. The most basic example of human perception, our eyesight, is a complex bundle of imagination, compensation, representation and interpretation. First of all, we do not see with our eyes at all, so even the term eyesight is misleading. We see with our brains. We capture light with our eyes, and that light moves through a complex biological system into our brains, which then represents that light in our consciousness as sight. And it takes a little bit of time for the light to travel through that complex biological system, about 70 milliseconds in fact. How long is 70 milliseconds? Well, if you were playing against me at tennis and you had a pretty decent serve, the ball would have crossed the net within 70 milliseconds of leaving your racket. What does that mean? Well, that means there are two almost contradictory things happening at the same time. One is that what you are seeing in real time in front of your eyes, the wiggling of your fingers or the appearance of this red panda, actually happened 70 milliseconds ago, so we are experiencing life in a time lag. Secondly, our brains compensate for the delay by filling in or projecting forward based on experience, which is why professional tennis players will be better at returning your serve than me, because their brains will be able to interpret the trajectory of the ball more quickly and project forward where the ball is likely to land, making it more likely that they will play a good return of serve. So on one hand, we are living in the past, and on the other, our brains are literally imagining the future in order to make life play as a smooth visual display in our heads. This is one of the theories why police officers who have accidentally shot a suspect claiming they pulled out a gun, when in actual fact the suspect was holding a mobile phone, they are thought to have actually seen a gun. In a high-pressure scenario like this, the brain works overtime to deliver maximum information and also facilitate fast decision-making. One of the theories is that the brain literally bypasses some of the real visual information and fills it in with information stored in our memories because this is faster. The result is that the police officer has genuinely seen a gun in the suspect's hand, but what they have seen is actually being imagined, literally putting the image in imagination. So how on earth does that little aside relate to services marketing? You will see on the slide the greyed out box at the bottom half of the model, the service delivery box. Our perceptions of that service have gone through an equivalent process of interpretation and decoding in the same way light travelling to the brain does. Unfortunately for service marketers, they have no control over the last vital stage in perception of the customers. The same way the poor suspect can't stop the police officer seeing a gun, service marketers have to navigate this final difficult step in service delivery. In their research, Parasuram, Zaitamal and Berry noted a couple of examples of this. In an example of a bank where a customer was trying to cash a cheque that was forward dated, in other words it was not yet valid, the bank staff told the customer that they couldn't cash the cheque and the customer would have to return another day. The customer was angry about this and saw this as poor service, as the bank's refusal to do what she wanted. However, it was actually illegal for the bank to honour a cheque before its date. The customer did not know the legal barrier and the bank did not explain it to the customer. So the customer expected to cash the cheque, and then their perception of the experience was that the bank was refusing to let her cash the cheque. So the bank fell foul of the fact that the communication of the process was perceived as being determined by the bank rather than the laws that the bank has to follow. Therefore, there is a lesson for the bank to learn in this case, but often businesses don't get the opportunity to gather such insights in order to adjust their service delivery. So Gap 5 is about the gap between expectations and then perceptions of what actually happened. So this is why Gap 5 sits where it sits. It's why we see the service experience sitting as a constructed idea across both the service delivery and the perceived service in this model. A service experience is a bit like that tennis example I used earlier. It isn't an objectively observable thing. It emerges through the simultaneous encounter between producer and consumer. That concludes this section. Let's summarize what we've covered. Services marketing evolved from a basic definition to contemporary ideas of service value. Service quality is more complex as a construct than product quality, and that's partly down to the service encounter. Service quality perceptions are not objective, they are subjective for each customer. And we can conceptualize service quality using the disconfirmation paradigm, the gaps between expectations and perceptions. That concludes part 4. Next, we'll be looking at service failure and recovery.